So let's look at ways that you could think about building a program in PHP. And one of the most common things that we do is sort of take a very traditional, probably too traditional approach of thinking about sort of input, process, output. What that really translates into thinking about, what data are we gathering from the user, thinking about what do we need to actually do the work, what do we actually calculate, what's the process that's going on in the middle of that, and then what do we actually present to the user at the end of that process. And what that normally does is that leads us to start thinking about, what will be the variables that we will actually use when we construct our programs. How many of them will there be, a feel for what kind of information will go in those variables, what values will actually end up inside those boxes. Now, for things that are on the web, what that traditionally translates to with server-side stuff, like the stuff we do in PHP, is that you have a form and a response page. I mean, not everything looks like this, and some of the smaller exercises that we've been doing, they're just a single sort of piece of code because we're just demonstrating something. But something more meaningful, a typical web application has that kind of notion of gather some information from the user, perhaps on a form, and then do some work and then present the response to the user. And we have that split, this notion that we'll gather information from the user on the form, and then what we'll do is on the response page, we'll do the work, we'll do the calculation, and then we'll present the information back to the user. Now, real web applications, the architecture is more complicated than that. And if you think about something like Amazon, then you'd have a form where you might type in, I'm looking for a particular book, and then the response page might show you the particular choices. And then you might click again, so in a way it's another form, and then another response page, and then you might say add to basket, another response page. So you've got these kind of interactions going on, passing between these different pages. But for the simple examples that we're looking at, you can really focus on it just being kind of like a form and a response. So the form is gathering the data, and the response is actually the response is actually dealing with that notion of, well, what is it that we're actually doing? What is it we're calculating? What am I showing back to the user at the end of that process? So let's look at a small example here. And this is the example where we're gathering information from a user, and the information we're going to gather is going to be their name, and that's going to be their first name and their last name. And what we want to do is we want to print those names out in reverse order with a space between them. So if they typed in sort of Fred, QWERTY, then we would print out QWERTY Fred. So it's just a simple little example just to demonstrate the notion of how we would sort of build the program up, we'd think about the program, and some of the techniques that we would use typically when we're gathering information from the user. So the first part, accepting the user's first name and last name, that's in this scenario with PHP, we're going to have a form to do that. And printing them out in reverse order, that's going to be our response page. So let's just let's go into this in a little bit more detail and let's dig down into it. If it's going to be a form, we've got choices, and the choices are, we could have like two fields. We could have a field for the first name and a field for the last name. We could have a single field. Those choices will impact on what we write later on our response pages. So in this example, I'm going to have just one input field. I think it's quite nice for people to actually just be able to type in like Fred space QWERTY and then click OK. Doesn't have to be like that. Imagine you were collecting names, addresses and ages. Then you might look at that and you might go, well, name, address, age, that's 3 fields. Or you might have more fields. But what this is actually already making you do is it's thinking about what form elements will I have. In your mind, you should be thinking, okay, how's that going to translate into variables? And of course, very important, make up sensible names for things. So I don't know, I could call it both names, for example. If I have one input form and I call it both names, and of course that as a form would translate into something like this. I've decided just to have one input field. I'm going to call it both names. And there's some other things on there, but I'm not going to talk about those in this presentation because I've done it before. The notion of the way that the information passes from page to page, the method, and the fact that we've got a button on there. So there's my form. Let's have a think about the response page. Well, we want our response page to print those items in reverse order with a space between them. Now, response pages, you know, the PHP has a flow, and we flow from the top to the bottom. So that would mean something like get the data, do the work, or do the calculation, whatever the process is that we're actually going to perform, and then print out the result at the bottom. That's a very simple response page. Of course, when it comes to flow, the flow here is from top to bottom. You also have choices. You know, there could be a scenario where you're trying to write something where the actual flow of the program requires you to have different choices. You know, if they're over 20, do this. If they're under 20, do this. If they've elected this option choice, we're going to go here. If they've elected to pick this option choice, we're going to go to this other place. And that would be done with an if or a switch statement. You can make something quite complicated, obviously, by changing the flow. Often you think to yourself, okay, I'm going to do this thing many times, and you have to sort of set a sort of mental alarm in your mind, think about if I'm going to be doing something multiple times, 5 times, 10 times, 50,000 times, you think loop. Rather than do it many times, just write it out once and embed it in a loop so it's done over and over again. Now, with this simple example, what are we going to do? Well, we want to something like get the data at the top of the code. We're going to get the first name and the last name. Once we've got the first name and the last name, we can reverse the order and then we can print it out. So I'm taking that sort of top level, high level, just description of what we're going to do, and I'm trying to break it down into smaller steps. And here I've got 4 steps. Obviously you could have something which is more complicated. Often if you find something seems really, really large and really complicated, just try and break it down into small steps. I mean, the next step could be to actually take one of these lines, and you might find that needs to be broken down into even smaller steps. You're just taking that big chunk, that big idea, that concept, whatever it is that you need to do, just break it down into smaller parts and smaller parts until you think, okay, roughly I could translate these. I've got an idea of what these are going to do when I translate them into PHP. So, get the data, that's going to be, get or post, something like that. Find the first name, last name. Well, there's a really useful function, and we've talked about it before, called explode. And what explode does is it takes a string and it converts it into an array. So it takes a string and it converts it into a collection of cells. And what we can do with explode is we can describe, when we use the explode function, how that string should be split. So we could, for example, say split the string wherever there's a space. Or let's say you were entering some data, which was a series of numbers with commas between them. We could say split the data set on a comma. Construct reverse order, well, something like that. Let's imagine we've got the last name and the first name separate. In this instance, all we want to do is print it out, so we're going to convert it into a string. So it's going to be something like last name dot first name. And of course, what we want to do is we want to put a little space in the middle of that. So I'm just going to do the string concatenation, and I'm going to go double quotes, space, double quotes, just to put a nice little space in the middle. And I'm going to print that out. So whatever the reverse name is, I'm going to just print those values out. We've got to the point with this where we could actually try and start translating those lines directly into PHP. So, using get or post, it's going to be something like this. Now, my suggestion is, as I've said before, try and use the same names in the PHP as you do on the form. So the form element name is the same as the PHP variable name. You don't have to do that, but particularly when you're learning this stuff, it's just easier. Common mistakes are you make slight differences in the names and then you forget which name you're using, or you put a capital letter in there, something like that. The easiest thing to do is just to make sure you use exactly the same name. So the form element was called both names. So I'm going to extract that from the post array, and I'm going to create a cell. I'm going to create a variable called both names, and that is going to contain both names. Now this next line uses the explode function, and what I do with the explode function needs two pieces of data to do its work. So it's a function similar to functions in a spreadsheet or in mathematics. It's a function, we're going to use brackets, and the function has to do something for it to do its work. Explode needs two pieces of data. The first thing that we tell it is we tell it what are we going to split the string on. So in this instance, I'm going to split the string on the space character. So you can see I've got that as the first thing there inside the brackets, double quotes with a space between them. And we separate the items of data that we're passing into the function with a comma. And after the comma, we pass in the name of the string. So reading that aloud, what that's actually saying is explodes is a function, and it's going to take two pieces of data. It's going to take whatever it is that we're going to split the string on, which in this instance is going to be a single space, and the string that we're actually going to do the work on. When explodes worked, when it's actually taken that string and exploded it into a series of cells, it will end up as an array, and we put that into a variable called split names. So split names will be an array with lots of different cells, and every single cell will contain one word. Now, in reality, I'd have to do all sorts of error checking at this point, but I'm not going to do that. We're going to keep it nice and straightforward. Let's just assume that they can type in a name in a very sensible way. So the first name, space, last name. And of course what we want to do now is we want to combine them. So it's going to be an array called split names, and like in most computer languages, we number cells from 0. So the second item is going to be in the array split names 1, and the first item is going to be in the array cell split names 0. So we just combine those together, because what we want to do is we want to construct a string. So I go split names 1, and then I add on a space, and then I add on split name 0. Now I've used the phrase add on there, but what we're actually doing is that thing that's called string concatenation. So we're combining strings together. So I take split names 1, which is a string, and I attach a space, and then I attach split name 0, which is also a space. And then I print it out, and that's going to look like that. So putting that all together, the code would look like this. Now if you want to find out about the explode function, there's a URL at the top. If you just type PHP explode into any search engine, it'll come up with details. And you can see here's our flow. Get the data at the top, do the work, print it out, something like that. Now I just want to mention a tip. Earlier on I was talking about loops. And it really is a matter of often you write code and then you kind of go, oh, actually, I'm sure I can write this in a more efficient way. So you could, for example, find yourself just repeating things over and over again, and it works and it's fine, but there must be a more efficient way of writing something like this. So here, for example, we're printing out a table, and these are the rows inside a table. So you can see we've got mixed stuff going on here. We've got some HTML, and in the middle we've got some PHP, and then there's some HTML at the end. So let's look at that in more detail. More specifically then, I've got 5 table rows in HTML, and each table is going to contain 2 columns. And the way that we actually mark out columns in HTML is to use the table data tags. So you can see we've got 2 pairs of table data tags. In the first column we've got a number, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. In the second column we're printing out module, whatever that is, like the module name or something. So module is an array and it's numbered from 0 to 4, and we're printing out the text, the contents of a module in that gap. Now that's fine, but again, this is one of the things where that alarm goes off. Oh, maybe I could turn this into a loop. Would it look nicer? Particularly, I mean, I've only got 5 here. You know, imagine this, if there was 10 or 20 of these, it would make sense to use a loop instead of just repeating this over and over again. So you think loop, and the way to do that is you think, okay, I'm not going to repeat it 5 times. I'm just going to write it once, and I'm going to embed it in a loop. So you sort of end up with something that looks like this. So I've taken one of those lines and I've sort of placed it inside the loop construct. So there's the standard loop syntax in PHP and in many other languages. Inside the brackets, you can see we're going to use a counter called I. I starts with a value of 0, and we're going to go round and round the loop while I is less than 5, less than or equal to 5. And every time we go around the loop, we're just going to add 1 to I, and then we just print the values out, something like that. Now, that line, which has come naturally from the previous slide, will generate an error message. And the reason that it will generate an error message is because it's a sort of hybrid line. It's got HTML in it and it's got PHP in it. So that won't work. We need to go a sort of little bit further, because what will happen is the first line, the PHP interpreter will go, well, this is PHP. I'm perfectly happy with that. It's a loop. But the moment it comes to the second line, it will see the tr tag and go, well, this isn't PHP, and generate an error message. It won't be able to interpret that because it's not valid PHP syntax. So we need to alter that second line a little bit. We need to turn it into valid PHP. And one of the standard things that you would do here is to turn it into a print statement. So we turn it into something that looks like this. Now I've got both bits of code here so you can see them on the same slide. So the top bit of code is what we had originally, and if you just look at the second 3 lines, you can see how we've translated that line into something which is valid PHP. We've turned it into a print statement. So I've had to go through it. What I've done is I've taken the bits that were HTML and I've turned them into a valid PHP string. So I put the print statement in, and then I just work my way along. So the trtd, that's HTML, so I wrap it up as a string. Then I'm going to print I, then I'm going to print a closing TD tag and an opening TD tag. Then I'm going to print the module, and then I'm going to finish the line off by printing another string. And there's string concatenation going on in here. So working my way along it again, I've got a string, which is in double quotes, that's that trtd bit. I'm going to print a value, the value of the loop counter. Then I'm going to print the closing tags, so that's another string. Then I'm going to print the module, and then I'm going to do the td/tr thing at the end. Now, always bear in mind you must check the loop counter. So I've got a number here which is hard coded, the number 5. You shouldn't really do that. What would be much more appropriate would be to use a function that I've mentioned before, which is count. And what count does is count returns, as the program is running, it returns the number of elements there are in the array. So the next step would be just to fix that top line and put the little count function in there, count module, just on the top line. And what that will do is, if more cells are added to module, dynamically as the program is running, that loop will still be valid. You should never really hard code the literal value in there where the 5 is.